we have read Leviticus 25, which is, of course, a fairly lengthy reading because there's lots of aspects to the study of the Redeemer. And tonight we're going to look at the Redeemer and specifically the Jubilee. And when we look at the Redeemer in the Bible, the description is, or the Strong's Concordance gives us the description of the Gaal, which is basically translated, or the meaning is the Redeemer to deliver, to act as a kinsman or a redeemer, to avenge, to revenge, to ransom, to buy back, or to do the part of the kinsman. So there are really three specific roles that kind of come out of this. The first, which we're going to look at tonight, is the Redeemer who brought back from slavery, related to the Jubilee in Leviticus chapters 25 and 27. And then there is the Redeemer, the Avenger of blood, which is found in Numbers 35 and Deuteronomy 19. And then there is the Redeemer who is the one who is to raise up seed, known as the house builder, which picks up on the Levirate law and, of course, comes from Deuteronomy 25, but predates this going back. We have record of it with Jacob and the sons of Judah, and, ones who did not perform the role of the Redeemer, and Judah himself, who ends up unwittingly performing that role. So tonight we're going to look at the Redeemer and those who were to be brought back from slavery, which of course relates to this law of the Jubilee as well. So in the scripture, there are multiple patterns, I guess you could say, that kind of play into this whole idea in the law of Sabbaths and of Jubilees being part of this whole regime. So we'd like to just kind of step back and look at them. The law of the Sabbath being the first of the series of cycles. So there's a series of cycles. And of course, it comes right out of the law of Moses. We have it there in Exodus 20 and verse 8, that they were to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And the Sabbath, or Shabbat as it's called in Israel, literally means to cease, to desist, or to rest. And it was to be holy, meaning kadesh, or consecrated, dedicated, hallowed, separated, or sanctified. So it was dedicated to God for a specific purpose. So it wasn't just a day of doing nothing. It was a day that was reserved and dedicated to God. Now, as we kind of pick up the rest of the context in Exodus chapter 20, we look at basically the Ten Commandments is where it's really rooted in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then he kind of describes this a little bit further in verse 9, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but in the seventh day, it's a Sabbath of Yahweh thy God. In it thou shalt do no work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, or stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day, the seventh day, and he hallowed it. So the whole law is predicated on what God did in creation. And so we have that first in the cycle, which is the Sabbath day, which was to be sanctified and set aside to God, and they were not to do any work in it. And it wasn't just them, it was neither them nor their servants, their maidservants, men servants, cattle, strangers, or anybody within thy gates, which is ironic because now the Jewish people quite often can have Gentiles that will come along and serve on the Sabbath day, but not Jews themselves. But nonetheless, that's the first in the series of cycles. After this, we have then the Sabbath year. So there's a Sabbath day, and then every seventh year, there was to be a Sabbath year. So this was the second in the series of cycles. And this comes up in Leviticus 25 and verse 2, where we read, when you come into the land which I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath unto the Lord, right? So this idea of keeping a Sabbath to Yahweh, and he defines it, 6 years shalt thou sow thy field, and 6 years shalt you prune the vineyard and gather the fruit thereof. But in the seventh year it shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for Yahweh, but thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord at the harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed. It is a year of rest unto the land. So that word rest there basically is the idea of a Shabbathon, which is the idea of a Sabbath of observance. So this was a Sabbath year. It's a year of rest, and they were not to work the field during that year. So just like there was 7 days, 6 days for work and a 7th of rest, there were now 7 years where they were not to work that 7th year, the field. So as we look at that pattern, it was a time of rest, and it was fairly clearly laid out. It was to be meat for you. It was something basically to be devoted, a devoted thing or a reward for you, for your servant, for your maid, for your hired servant, your stranger that sojourneth with thee, and also for the cattle and for the beasts that are in the land. Shall the increase thereof be meat. So you can see there how it was to be completely set aside unto Yahweh. Now, this, of course, requires faith, because when you think of Israel and you think of them as they were serving their God, in verse 20, the question was asked, as our brother read, what shall we eat in the 7th year? So it's completely, as far as practicality goes, it's an impractical demand. Behold, we shall not sow nor gather in our increase. Well, God says, I will command my blessings upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. And ye shall sow the 8th year, and yet eat the old fruit until the 9th year, when this food comes in. Until her fruits come in, shall ye eat of the old store. So kind of similar to the manna in the wilderness, there would be enough on the 6th day to carry them through the 7th. So we could see basically how this pattern was picking up on the Sabbath day, right back into the law of Moses, right back when they were wandering through the wilderness. That Sabbath day of rest would provide for them. And then we have a Sabbath of years. So it's called the Jubilee or the Jubilee, which was basically a whole period of years. So now just it's a Sabbath of years. So we have 7 sevens, and on the last of those sevens, there would be a Sabbath to Yahweh. Thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. So there was a 49-year period that was going to be sort of laid out to them. It was a Sabbath of years, and thou shalt cause the trumpet of Jubilee or Jubilee to sound in the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. So this was the time of the Day of Atonement. It was the trumpet of the Jubilee. It was the shofar, the ram's horn that would sound, and it would be the Jubilee. In this case, is not the same word Yobel. It's a different word. It's the idea of an alarm during the new moon or the Kodesh. So that's kind of the idea, or the new month. And it was a time of renewing, of making anew. And so this was the situation. It would be during the Day of Atonement. It was the day, or Yom and Kippur, atonement, which was the time of the covering. So it was on Yom Kippur that this would take place, that the Sabbath trumpet would blow, or the Jubilee trumpet would blow, the shofar would be blown. And that idea of the atonement, of course, is the same idea that's picked up in Exodus 30, verse 10. They were to make an atonement upon the horns of it once in the year with the blood of the sin offering of atonements. Once in the year shall he make an atonement upon it throughout your generations. It is most holy to Yahweh. So it was only once a year. And that word atonement, again, is the word kafar, which means to cover, to purge, to make an atonement, to make reconciliation, to cover over, or actually to pitch. And it's the same word that's used in Genesis 6:14, the idea of pitching over the ark. So it was a covering that was going to take place. So when we think of the ark and we think of that Day of Atonement, sometimes it gets a little complex, but really the words are not that difficult. The covering of the ark was the kaparet, which was literally a covering. It means to cover. It's only used of the covering of the Ark of the Covenant, the innermost recess in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. Now, in Hebrews, the word mercy seat is also translated propitiation. So when we think about that in the New Testament, it's a word that's, somewhat difficult to spell, perhaps, or read. But it simply means a covering. And so it's related to this idea of the mercy seat, the caperet, or the covering. Now, we know it probably in more vernacular terms. You think of the Jews, they wear that little beanie on the top of their head called a yarmulke in Yiddish, but in Hebrew, it's a kippah. And so when you think about that, it takes its root from the word kafar or kippur, which literally means a covering. So you have that Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, the Day of Covering. So that's when the year of Jubilee would be sounded, and it was the 50th of the year. So the Jubilee shall be the 50th year unto you. You shall not sow neither reap that which groweth of itself, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. So when you think about this, this would be, a period of time that would be a Jubilee that was going to be holy. It was that 50th year, which meant that for 2 years now, the land would lay fallow, because you have 7 years, so you have the 7 sevens. So on the end of that 7th year, you would have no plow or sowing, and then you would have the 50th year where it would also sit fallow for that period of time. So it definitely would have required faith of the children of Israel, and it was during that time that that Jubilee trumpet would be sound. So that word Jubilee is the word Yobel. It's the ram's horn, the trumpet of Jubilee that marks the blowing of trumpets, or the Jubilee year marked by the blowing of trumpets. And literally, it comes from the word Yabal, which means to bear along or to carry, to lead away, to be conducted, or to be delivered. And Gesenius adds the phrase, a joyful sound to this. That's how the word is actually defined. So when we think about it in the scriptures, in Leviticus 25, no doubt it would have been a joyful year, because in verse 10, they were to proclaim liberty to all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee or a yobel to you, and ye shall return every man to his possession, and ye shall return every man to his family. So when we think about it, every 50 years, there would be this release after the 7 sevens, that series of years that would take place. That 50th year would be the year of release, where all the captives would go back to the land, and they were to hallow it and keep it holy. And so it was that 50th year. They were not to sow. They were not to reap. They were not to reap that which grows of itself or gather the grapes of thy vine. They were to leave it undressed. It was to be basically a jubilee, and they were to eat the increase of the field thereof out of the field. So when you think about that, it's something that would definitely have required of them some real faith. And it was to be that year of Jubilee when everybody was to return to his possession. So no doubt it would have been a time of great joy for the people, because they were returning to their possession. Now, of course, there is one more cycle. It doesn't come up here, but it's basically follows the same pattern. That's the millennium, which was going to be a Sabbath of thousands. So we think about this, we pick it up from different places in Scripture, but it follows the same pattern that there would be a Sabbath of thousands to the children of Israel. So when we think about that, we have it. It comes up in Hebrews chapter 4, actually, if you just want to turn there, because this is where Paul picks up on this concept, and he's talking about the Sabbath, and he's talking about the rest, and he's talking about the children of Israel going through the wilderness. And he says, we which have believed do enter into a rest. As he said, this is verse 3, I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. So he's referring to Israel, and he's saying basically that they wouldn't enter into his rest. although they could have, but they were not going to. And so he cites the scriptures. He says, "For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, God did rest the seventh day of all his work." So we see there the pattern. And again, he says in this place, "If they shall enter into my rest. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief." So he's kind of emphasizing to us that, look, this was a promise that was made. It was not fulfilled because they didn't enter into the rest. Therefore, there's more coming. And what he's referring to, of course, is Psalm 95, where he talks about harden not your hearts as in the day of provocation, as in the day of temptation in the wilderness. Because he says, when your fathers tempted me and proved me and saw my work, 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart. They have not known my ways. I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. So this was the issue. They have not known my ways. So the core of the problem was God manifestation. They didn't know his ways. And of course, the Lord says to us in John, this is life eternal, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. But they didn't know his ways. And so that generation was not going to enter in. And so the apostle basically makes the point, well, then there's got to be another generation that will. And so in Hebrews 4, verse 7, he says again, he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, if that you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, for if Joshua had given them rest, they would not have afterwards spoken of a day. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. So he limited a certain day, basically saying after so long a time, and of course these people didn't go in, but there remains therefore a rest, he says, to the people of God. And so that, of course, is what we are looking for. And so when you look at that and you think about this idea of the rest for the people of God, this was what they'd been looking for through the wilderness. In fact, if you remember, if you go back to Numbers chapter 10, this was where, as they're traveling through the wilderness, the ark would go out ahead of them, searching out a rest. So we have it there, the ark searching in verse 33, they departed from the mount of Yahweh, 3 days' journey. The ark of the covenant of Yahweh went before them in the 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. And of course, this has a great spiritual lesson to us with the Lord Jesus Christ, who has gone ahead of us to search out a resting place for us. But that was the picture that was given back under the law. And so coming back to where Paul is writing, he basically saying, look, this is, saying that down the road, there was going to come this time. And so he emphasizes there, therefore, remains a rest for the people of God. And that's the 7,000th year that we are looking for. And of course, Peter brings it up, in 2 Peter 3, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, as in 1,000 years as one day. And the 90th Psalm, for 1,000 years are in thy sight as but yesterday, when it is past as a watch in the night. So we have that pattern of the 7 days of creation. And Peter makes the analogy that 1,000 years is as a day. So as we have 6 days and then the seventh day of rest, we pick that up, and Paul's kind of sewing those pieces together, that is what we are looking for. And of course, that takes us through to the book of Revelation, because that is exactly what we're going to see in Revelation 20 in verse 4, where he says, I saw thrones, and them that sat on them, judgment was given unto them, and I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, for the word of God, which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. So that's that 1,000 years of rest that we look forward to, the millennia, in the final picture of things. So as we kind of follow this through, we start off with the micro series, which is the Sabbath. So it was the first of the 7th day periods, the 7th day of every week. And then we would have 7 years, which would be the Sabbath year. And then there would be the Yobel, the Sabbath of years, the Jubilee, which is kind of like you've gone from the micro to the macro to the mega. And then you have the ultimate picture, which of course is the millennium, which is the Sabbath of the 1,000 years. So all of those pictures kind of lay out for us in what we see in Leviticus as it kind of starts here. We've got the Sabbath day, then the Sabbath of years, and then basically the Yobel, which or the Sabbath year, and then the Sabbath of years, and then picking up with what Paul says in Peter, we have, of course, the millennial period, which ties in with the book of Revelation. So just to kind of see how that scope kind of comes together, and we'll come back to this at the end of the class. But what we want to do then is start looking then at this idea of the Sabbath. And the purchasing of the brother, the period of rest and the period of relief. So when we come back then to Leviticus chapter 25, if you just want to turn back there in your Bibles, and we pick up the threads here of what is going on in Leviticus chapter 25, we see in this picture, if you sell aught unto your neighbor in verse 14, or buyest aught of thy neighbor's hand, ye shall not oppress one another. So that was one of the critical things that God drives home in this law, that they were his servants. This is what he says, actually. We just look at the very last verse there. You are unto me, the children of Israel, are servants. They are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. So he drives home to them, they were not to oppress one another because they had been servants, and they were his servants, and he brought them out of the land. So when it came to this whole process of, if you fell on bad times and you had to sell your land, or if you bought somebody's land, there was a set formula for this. And it's fascinating because in the land, there was no such thing as inflation. It just didn't exist in the land of Israel. So in verse 15, according to the number of the years after the Jubilee, thou shalt buy of thy neighbor, and according of the number of years of the fruits, he shall sell unto thee. So it came down to a simple formula. Whatever was left before the Jubilee, and the fruit that basically that land would bring forward, that was the worth of the land. According to the multitude of years, thou shalt increase the price thereof, and according to the fewness of the years, thou shalt diminish the price of it, according to the number of the years of the fruits that he selleth unto you. You shall not oppress one another, for thou shalt fear Yahweh thy God, or fear thy God. I am Yahweh your God. So it's a very critical thing that Israel was not to treat each other poorly. So if we were to take this and kind of just extrapolate it out and say, well, how does it work? Well, quite simply, the land, if it produced $1,000 of produce per year, and there were 10 years left before the Jubilee, the land would be worth 10 years times the $1,000, which would be $10,000. That was the cost of the land. That's what the person who sold it would get, and that's what the buyer would have to pay. It was not a negotiated price. It's not like anybody's like wheeling and dealing. That's what the land was worth, and that's what they would have to pay. So kind of a fascinating thing to see that God set the value of the land, and there was no nonsense with this. There's no used car salespeople kind of like, jimmying the price here, or people, as the proverb says, saying it's worth more and it's not worth more. It was worth what the land could produce over that period of time. So the other thing was, there was no selling it forever. In verse 23, the land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, and you are strangers and sojourners with me, which I think is a fascinating point. Like they were not allowed to give it away forever. And in all the land of your possession, you shall grant a redemption for the land. And so this is predicated on the law, or the law is predicated on the promises to Moses in Genesis, or to Abraham, in Genesis 17. I will give unto you and to thy seed after the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So the land was not theirs to give away. because God says, look, the land is mine, and you are strangers and sojourners with me. And so they couldn't just, sell it eternally. It was God's land, and they could only sell it for the price up until the Jubilee when everything got reset. Now, when you look at that and you look at purchasing the land, there, of course, are examples in Scripture where, like we have here with Ahab in 1 Kings 21, verses 2 to 3, where Ahab wanted Naboth to sell him his land. He said, "Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near to my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it, or if it seem good to thee, I will give you the worth of it in money." And Naboth said to Ahab, "Yahweh forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee." So here we see very much a principle that's laid out there that Abraham had been promised the land, and is the inheritance of my father, said Naboth, and he couldn't give it to Ahab for a permanent possession. It didn't matter what he did, if he gave him a better vineyard or if he gave him money for it, that was not his to give away, because the land was God's. And so, when you look at this, there was a problem in the time of Israel. If you just come to Isaiah chapter 5, so this is on from the time of Ahab, but it's not something that went away. There were those who were trying to take other people's possessions. So in Isaiah 5, and this is reading from the Complete Jewish Bible, "Woe to those who add house to house, that join field to field, until there's no room for anyone else. And you live in splendor alone on your land." And you can kind of say, well, that is today by no stretch of the imagination. That's the way it is. But that's what they were doing, is they were increasing their land. And if you just come over to Micah chapter 2, this comes up in the prophecy of Micah as well, where this was one of the things that Israel was indicted for. So in Micah chapter 2, verse 1, "Woe to them that devise iniquity, that work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields, they take them by violence, and houses, and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage." So, that was the problem. And God says, "Wherefore thus saith Yahweh, behold, against this family do I devise evil, from which he shall not remove your necks, neither shall you go out hastily, or haughtily, for it is a time of evil." So the prophecy of Micah begins with how God would bring judgment on them because they neglected his promises in the things that he had laid out in the land. And so when we come back to Leviticus 25, these were the principles that were laid out in there, that they were not to oppress their brother. They were not to steal their brother's land or basically try and swindle him out of it anyway. But there was provision if somebody ran into trouble. So come back to Leviticus 25, and let's look at verse 25. "If your brother be waxen poor, and hath sold away some of his possession, and if any of his kin come to redeem it, then shall he redeem that which his brother sold." So that was the rule, basically. If my brother had sold his land, but I was able to redeem it, and I came, and I was to redeem it, it had to be redeemed. I couldn't hold on to it and say, "Look, I've got a transaction here. I bought this land. I've made this investment." It had to be sold back to the Redeemer. And when you keep reading there, "If a man have none to redeem it, and himself be able to redeem it, then he could go ahead and redeem it. Let them count the years of the sale thereof, and restore the overplus unto the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession." So again, the value of the land was such that whatever was left, it had to go back to him. Now, it could be that somebody had had an injury and their kids were too young to look after the land. So the land would, he couldn't look after it himself anymore. And so that being the case, he was able to sell it until he could recover, and then it would go back to his possession. And so there was the ability to buy back the land. And so that's the idea we have in verse 28. If he's not able to restore it to him, then that which is sold shall remain in the hand of him that hath bought it until the year of Jubilee. But when it came to the Jubilee, it would go out and everybody would return to their possession. So that was the situation, is that if you couldn't redeem it, if you didn't have a redeemer who could come and buy the land, a brother or a cousin or whoever it might be, then it would stay in the hand of the person who had bought it until the year of Jubilee. And at that point in time, it would go back out. Now, one of the other things that was laid upon them is that they could not take usury. And there was a principle here that they had to abide by. If your brother, verse 35, be waxen poor and fallen in decay with thee, thou shalt relieve him. Yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. So, you think about that and you say, well, Christ's parable, well, who is my brother? And you can't just kind of like, well, I'm not going to do anything. You were expected to do something if you could do something to help your brother out. And verse 26, take no usury of him or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. Thou shalt not give him the money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. So you could buy the worth of the land, you could give your brother a loan, but you were not allowed to take money from him and charge interest. And you think, well, why was that? Well, again, God reminds them, I'm Yahweh your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So God's reminding them of their pedigree, that they had been bought as slaves out of the land of Egypt, and they were by no means to forget this and simply to, oppress their brother. And so this is the picture we have. It's picked up in two New Testament passages, in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and James chapter 2. So if we just take a look at these two passages, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, when we get this principle that we've got there, if any provide not for his own house, and especially those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So you think about what the law said. If your brother needs your help and you don't, well, here Timothy tells you you're worse than an infidel. So the same principle that was under the law travels right the way through and is there as well in the New Testament. James chapter 2, if your brother or sister be naked and destitute of food, so again, they've waxen poor and fallen into decay, the expectation was that thou shalt relieve them. And one of you say to him, well, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give them not those things which are needful for the body, what doth it profit? Even so, faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. So that was the principle that was picked up, and it's picked up again in the Epistle of John, if we just come over to 1 John. In the Epistle of John in chapter 3, the same idea is brought in here as well, that you couldn't just walk away or turn your mind or your heart away from your brother. Whosoever hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shuts up the bowels of his compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? So that is the principle of God manifestation. My little children, he says, let us not love in word nor in tongue, but in deed and in truth. So the idea is, this is not some kind of academic exercise, but it needs to be our belief, our manifestation of the character of the Father needs to be in deed and needs to be in truth. It needs to be in action and it needs to be in reality. The word truth there literally meaning that which is put into action, that which is factual because it has happened. So those are the principles that get pulled right into the New Testament. So when we look at this idea, the Leviticus Jubilee and the redeeming of your brother, it wasn't something that was just Old Testament and was under the law and would pass away, would be gone. So when we continue to look at this, Leviticus 25, we have that idea, if he's waxen poor and he's sold unto you, you are not to compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as an hired servant, and as a sojourner he shall be with thee, he shall serve thee unto the year of the Jubilee. So you were not to treat him like a slave, but rather as an employee, as a hired servant. You couldn't simply, think that you could get away with treating him super poorly and oppress him or whatever else, because he was to be a sojourner with you. You were to treat him as a hired servant, and at the year of Jubilee, he would go out. And so those are the principles in the Old Testament, but they also get picked up in the New Testament. We think of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2. They were to feed the flock of God, which was among them, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. So they had to have this readiness of service, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but in samples to the flock. So in this case, it's talking obviously about leading in the ecclesia, but the idea was that they were not to oppress their brethren. They were not to be lords over God's heritage, but in samples or examples to the flock. And again, it's picked up in Romans. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. So the same principles picked up like by Paul, just like it was under the law, that they couldn't behave this way because they had been slaves in Egypt and God had brought them out. So it's a wonderful thing when you see it, very practical, and it had some great principles that are pulled right forward into the New Testament. Now, it's interesting that this idea of the Redeemer kind of goes forward into the nation of Israel as well, because it had been sold into bondage. And if you just come to Isaiah 50, it's quite fascinating to see God's commentary on this, because you think about it, if your brother is waxen poor, whatever it was, and he sells himself or sells his land and he has to come and serve or whatever it might be, then they were to redeem him. But Israel, if we look at Isaiah chapter 50, God says here of Israel, he says, thus saith Yahweh, where is your bill of divorce, of your mother's divorcement, whom I have put away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you? He says, God says, I didn't do this. Behold, you yourselves, for your iniquities have sold yourselves, and for your transgression is your mother put away. So this is something that they had done themselves. And it's fascinating to see how this basically comes into play. So the selling of Israel was something that they had done, but God was going to redeem them. Wherefore, verse 2, he says, when I came, was there no man? When I called, was there none to answer? Is my hand shortened that I can't, shortened at all, that it cannot redeem? Or have I no power to deliver? So here God is saying, look, I can do this. I can redeem. Even though you've sold yourselves, my hand is not shortened that it can't redeem, nor that it cannot deliver. So he says, I'm going to rebuke, I will, at my rebuke, I will dry up the sea. I will make the rivers a wilderness. Their fish will stink because there's no water, and dieth for thirst. So God talks about through Isaiah how he's now going to redeem them and to deliver them. Now, this word redeem here is the word paduth or padut, which is the idea of a ransom, paying of an amount for the price of the release of someone or something from captivity. Now, it's not quite ransom the way that we think of it today. We think of today ransom, somebody takes somebody hostage and you have to go and you pay the ransom money and buy them back. This is not the way it was. They had sold themselves, or they'd sold their land, and basically this was the cost of redeeming them from captivity. And so the deliverer in this case, the Natsal, means to snatch away, to deliver, to rescue, to recover, to deliver from troubles, or to deliver from guilt and sin. So when we think about Israel selling themselves, there is also the picture of the Redeemer of Israel who would come. So just come over a couple of pages to Isaiah 52. We see here the picture of Israel's redeeming. Isaiah 52, we read there in verse 2, "Shake thyself from the dust, arise and sit down, O Jerusalem, loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion." So we see again here, we've got Jerusalem that is to be released. It is the captive daughter of Zion. And he says, for thus saith Yahweh, you have sold yourself for naught, you shall be redeemed, but it's going to be without money. God is going to redeem them a special way. They had sold themselves because of their own iniquities, and God is going to redeem them. So when we look at this, if we come back to the 51st chapter of Isaiah, and he goes on there and says, "Art thou not it which hath dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, that hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over?" So here we see God bringing Israel back. The ransomed, those who have been redeemed, would return to their possession. "Therefore the redeemed of Yahweh shall return, and come with singing unto Zion. An everlasting joy shall be on their head. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and mourning shall flee away." Now, if you contrast that to the day of Jubilee under the law, or to the person that was being redeemed, it was a time of singing, a time of joy. Gladness and joy and sorrow and mourning would flee away because they had been redeemed. So we come back to Leviticus in chapter 25. We see here this picture of this blowing of the trumpet. "Thou shalt cause," verse 9, "the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all the land." And that would be the scene that Israel would return. It was the Jubilee, the alarm, the signal, the joyful sound. And we can certainly get this idea in our minds and our hearts when we think about what is taking place here with Israel in the land. And so this is the picture that we have in Isaiah chapter 54 as we kind of contrast between Isaiah and Leviticus. We read there, "Yahweh is your husband," verse 5. "Yahweh of hosts is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called." So he was their Gaal. "For Yahweh has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, like a wife of youth when she is cast off, saith your God. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. In overflowing wrath for a moment I hid my face from you, but with everlasting love I will have compassion on you, says Yahweh, and your Redeemer." So this is the picture. He was their Gaal. He was going to be their Redeemer. Now, that idea of a Redeemer is also kind of like picked up in the idea of the Avenger as well. It's the Redeemer, the Avenger. It's in Isaiah 59 and verse 20. "The Redeemer shall come to Zion, and to them that turn away transgression in Jacob." Now, if you contrast that, so the Gaal in Isaiah 59, or in the law of the law of the Leviticus 25, where this is quoted, and it's picked up in Romans chapter 11, he's basically quoting back to the Isaiah passage and picking up on Leviticus 25. And in in Romans 11, he says, "All Israel shall be saved, it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer that shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant unto them when I will take away their sins." So all Israel will be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer. So you kind of have the same idea where now we're using New Testament language. It's the word that's translated here for redeem is the word in the Greek here, to draw oneself, to rescue, to deliver, to draw from danger, to set free. Again, the idea of to buy back, to ransom, or the Redeemer. So this is how it's used. The Greek word for Gaal is this Roamai, or however you pronounce it. And that's the picture that we have. So when we think about that, just taking this principle to ourselves and say, well, Israel is going to be redeemed. There's going to become a deliverer that turns away ungodliness from Jacob. Well, the same picture we have in Romans 7:24. Who shall deliver me from this body of death? That's the question. And the idea there is to redeem me. The same word is used. 2 Corinthians 1, verses 9 to 10, who delivereth us from so great a death. And Colossians chapter 1, verses 12 to 14, he has delivered us from the power of darkness. So this is the same kind of concept, same word that's used here throughout, is us being redeemed from this body of death, from the nature that we possess, that basically is not our crime, it is our misfortune. So when we think about that idea, and it carries through into the New Testament, just come over to Ephesians chapter 1 for a moment, because the same idea that's rooted in the law is that there would be a redeemer or a deliverer, one who had the ability to buy them back. So in Ephesians chapter 1, we have this idea expressed here: blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places, according, verse 4, as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of the children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, wherein he hath made us accepted in the beloved. Now, if you just think about that, there is Israel called out of Egypt. God says, I brought you to myself. I'm the one who redeemed you. Here you have the saints who have been redeemed. They have been chosen. They have been blessed with spiritual blessings, becoming heirs of the promises, the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself. And so he says, in whom we have the redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the richness of his grace. And so that's the picture that we have in Ephesians. It's picked up again in Romans in chapter 8, where we have the same concept here in Romans chapter 8 and at verse 21, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption. So just listen to those words. We are delivered, we are redeemed from the bondage of our nature of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. So you think about that. There's the land was the inheritance of the children. God says, it's my land, I've given it to you. You can't sell it, you can't take it away forever. But they would be redeemed. They would deliver it from bondage to the glorious liberty of the children of God. And so that's that same picture here of being delivered, to be set at liberty. Slightly different word, but the same idea is here. So he goes on to say, for we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we groan within ourselves. Well, what are we waiting for? We're waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of the body. And that word redemption there is the idea of the buying back, the ransom, the liberation, the releasing effect, the buying back from bondage. After a brother had sold himself due to his misfortune, he would be purchased back. And so Paul says, for we are saved by hope, or as the definite article is there, the hope, which of course is the hope of Israel. But hope that is seen is not hope, for what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for it? So hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of a tie together of this principle that we have there in the Leviticus. It carries right the way through to the New Testament, the idea of the promise of the inheritance and the release from bondage. And so the same is true with us, the release from our nature. We look forward to that, to the inheritance, to the glorious liberty of the children of God. Now, I just want to take a minute and just kind of take this concept just a little bit further. We talked about those patterns at the beginning, how there was the Sabbath day, then there was the Sabbath year, and then there was the Jubilee period, and then we got into the millennia. Well, I just want to focus on that Jubilee period just for a moment and just look at the Jubilee time. when we consider how this all works, the Jubilees, there's been, I think, about 47 of them since 333 BC, right? And years ago, it was actually at Swanwick Bible School. I put up a version of this slide. I think it was April 2016. And the point we made back then was that there are events that take place every 50 years. In 1867, Mark Twain had described Palestine as a silent, mournful expanse. He says, we never saw a human being there. And then 50 years later, we have, of course, the drying up of the river Euphrates in 1917. Another event took place 50 years after that. In 1967, we saw the taking of Jerusalem by Israel. And at the time we mused, well, what would happen in 2017? And we didn't know at that point in time. Would there be some event in 2006-17? That there had been one in 1917, the drying up of the Euphrates. In 1967, Israel had become basically, or Judea and Jerusalem had become part of Israel again. What would happen in 2017? And of course, it was in 2017 that we had the proclamation from America to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and the recognition of areas of the Golan Heights and so on, and the pledge to move the embassy of America to Jerusalem, which was accomplished in the last year of Trump's rule. Well, interesting that there's some major events, because 2017 was definitely a major event. It's what kind of gave birth to the Abraham Accords, kind of changed the paradigm in the Middle East. Actually, what caused this war that's just taken place in Gaza was basically the idea that Israel would make peace with its Arab neighbors, with Saudi Arabia, it looked like, and so Hamas decided we got to do something about that. So we're still living through some of the troubles that have come out of that. But if you took this a little bit further, and you said, well, what about the next Jubilee period? 2067. Well, we believe, obviously, by then, the kingdom of God proper is going to be established. But I want to take you back a couple hundred years to a writer who had something to say about this kind of time period. And so this is Isaac Newton, the scientist Isaac Newton, who wrote more on prophecy than he did on science. So this is 1733. He says, so then the times and a half a time are 42 months or 1,260 days, or 3 years and a half, reckoning 12 months to a year and 30 days to a month, as is done in the calendar of the primitive year. And the days of short-lived beasts being put for the years of that lived, i.e. the kingdoms. So he says, the period of the 1,260 days is dated from the complete conquest of the three kings, AD or AC 800, will end in AC 2060. Now, it may end later, but I have no reason for seeing it ending sooner. This I mention not to assert when a time of the end shall be, but to put a stop to the rash conjectures of fanciful men who are frequently predicting the time of the end, and by so doing, bring the sacred prophecies into discredit as often as their predictions fail. Christ comes as a thief in the night, and it is not for us to know the time and the season which God hath put in his own breast. Now, interesting comment there by Isaac Newton. He had nothing to gain by this. He says, I'm looking at this time period, and I project it out to be 2060, which will be the end of all these things, or thereabouts. He says it might be a little bit later. Now, it's not for us to know. Actually, it's the day and the hour. But the times and the seasons is something that we do know. We do know the times and the seasons. Now, interestingly, it was Brother Thomas who used this idea of the trumpets of Jubilee in the trumpet of silver, which was to be sounded around this time. So Numbers 10, verses 2 to 4, they were to make 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece shall they make them. They shall use them for the calling of the assembly and for journeying of the camps when they shall blow with them. All the assembly shall assemble themselves to thee at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. If they blow but with one trumpet, then the princes, which are heads of the thousands of Israel, shall gather themselves unto thee. So the trumpets were used for the gathering of the people. Now, interestingly, in Leviticus 23, when they were to blow, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the first day of the months, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets and holy convocation. So one trumpet was to be blown on the first day of the month. And of course, we have that for the calling of the people and or the princes. And we parallel that with 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of the eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So Brother Thomas said, well, that first resurrection trumpet is the first of the 2 trumpets that is to be blown. And then in verse 9, then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. So on the 10th day, the 7th month was the day of atonement, and that was to be basically this trumpet of Jubilee for the ingathering of the people, basically, and for the release of the captives from the land. Now, when we take that and we just parallel it with just a couple of passages here, such as Isaiah 27, verse 13, it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria and the outcasts in the land of Egypt shall worship Yahweh in the holy mountain Jerusalem. So this idea of the blowing of the trumpet and the bringing together of Israel, those who were ready to perish, being brought together. And so it's based on those 2 trumpets, the first one being blown for the gathering of the heads of the tribes, and then the second one was to do with the redeeming of Israel. And on that premise, Brother Thomas said there's 10 years that are going to take place for judgment. Now, if we would just take what Isaac Newton said, and, we kind of follow that pattern of the Jubilee, and we work back from that 2067, and we would say, okay, well, and again, we're not picking a date here. I'm just looking at what this guy wrote in, the hundreds of years ago. And if we were to work our way back from this, we have the first trumpet blowing, which whenever it's going to blow, is the resurrection trumpet, which was a time period of 10 years. Now, into that, we have the resurrection and the judgment, which of course is given to us. We have then, once the saints are raised, under the law of Moses, there was a year of comfort, Deuteronomy 24 and verse 5. Then you would have the Elijah mission, which before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, as we look at it in Malachi 4, there would be this period of 3.5 years, and James tells us that that's how long it was that Elijah was the witness to the children of Israel. And then you have Armageddon, Joel 3, Zechariah 14, Ezekiel 38, Revelation 16, and so on. And then we begin the mid-heaven proclamation in Revelation 14, verses 6 to 7, which is also paralleled in Psalm 2. And that is what kicks off the 30 years of rebellion, or the 1 hour, so to speak, that is supposed to take place over this period of time. So if we were to work our way back to, 2017, 50 years, and we go back from that 30 years of rebellion when all of those things will come to an end, and then we look at, okay, you've got 10 years, and Brother Thomas says that's the return and the resurrection, and during that 10 years, we have all these other events going on. What that tells us, without, we don't know the exactness of all of this, but it's just a pattern that's there, and we're looking at patterns. It's telling us that we are living in absolutely the very last period. If that trumpet sounded in as we believe it did, 1917, 1967, and then we had 2017, and we had a pretty major event take place there, and then you go on 50 years to 2067, following that pattern. There's a lot that needs to get crammed in, into that time period, which tells us we absolutely have to be preparing for that trumpet of Jubilee. So like Simeon and Anna, we don't know the day or the hour, but we know we're living in that time period and we're looking for the consolation of Israel. So brothers and sisters and young people, we don't want to stress the dates here, but we're just looking at the pattern and saying, look, we're in the end game. We're in that time and that season. And so we read in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 11, seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God. And that's what we need to be. All the things around us that seem material are all going to melt away like this little ice cube until they're gone. Everything that we kind of hold onto, whether it's our houses, whether it's our jobs, our careers, our hobbies, whatever they may be, it's all going to pass away. And we know, based on the time periods, the Sabbaths, even the 6,000 years, we are absolutely in the very end of time. And so the exhortation to us as we look at the Jubilee is we got to live those principles now. We've got to help our brothers and sisters love one another as I have loved you, says the Lord Jesus Christ, and prepare one another for the kingdom age that is to come.
What